The ocean was endless, a horizon that seemed to stretch forever, blue upon blue, a void that swallowed certainty and left only courage and fear in its place. In the summer of 1492, three ships cut across that restless expanse, their sails catching the winds of destiny. On board, men whispered prayers, cursed under their breath, and stared into the unknown, while their leader, a stubborn Genoese mariner named Christopher Columbus, carried within him a vision that the world could be reached in ways no one had ever dared to imagine. He believed he would find riches, gold, and spices, a shortcut to Asia that would bring kingdoms to their knees and elevate him to eternal fame. But what he was really about to find was something greater, something neither he nor the crowned rulers of Spain could have predicted: a new world, one that would forever alter the course of history. Don't forget to like the video. Our American History series continues, and the story begins now. To understand the drama of that voyage, we must first understand the man himself. Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa around 1451, a time when the Mediterranean world was alive with trade, but also increasingly dangerous. Ships from Genoa, Venice, and other ports carried goods across seas that teemed with pirates and rival fleets. Columbus grew up in a world of sailors, merchants, and dreamers. His father was a wool weaver, but the young boy was drawn more to the ships docking at the harbor than to the looms of his family. He listened to stories told by sailors who had sailed to distant lands, tales of riches, strange people, and lands beyond the edge of the known world. From an early age, Columbus dreamed not just of traveling, but of discovering. The 15th century was a time of exploration. The Portuguese were leading the way, sailing down the coast of Africa, building forts, and carving a path toward the riches of India and China by circling the continent. They developed better ships, the caravel, and mastered the winds and currents of the Atlantic. Their success made them the envy of Europe. But to Columbus, it also planted an idea. What if, instead of sailing east and around Africa, one could sail west? The Earth, after all, was round. This much had been known since the time of the ancient Greeks. But how large was it? And how far across the ocean lay the fabled markets of Cathay, the spices of the Indies, the gold of Cipangu, Japan? Columbus believed the distance was much shorter than most experts thought. He imagined that by sailing west, he would not only reach Asia, but do so faster and with less danger than the Portuguese route. It was a bold idea, but one rooted in miscalculation. The world was far larger than Columbus guessed, and what lay between Europe and Asia across the Atlantic was not empty ocean, but an entire hemisphere unknown to Europeans. For years, Columbus tried to convince others of his plan. He sought support in Portugal first, but the Portuguese, wise from their own navigational successes, rejected him. His calculations, they said, underestimated the size of the world. If he sailed west, they believed he and his men would starve long before reaching Asia. Undeterred, Columbus took his plan to Spain. In the court of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, rulers united by marriage and by their vision of a powerful Spain, he found a more receptive audience. Still, it was not easy. Columbus was a foreigner, stubborn, and often arrogant. He demanded noble titles, lifelong rewards, and control over the lands he might discover. The Spanish crown hesitated. They had just completed the Reconquista, driving the last Muslim kingdom from Granada in 1492, and their treasury was stretched thin. For years, they dismissed Columbus, but his persistence was unrelenting. He lobbied, argued, and found allies among church officials and courtiers who believed his voyage could bring glory to Spain and spread Christianity to new lands. Finally, in April of 1492, Isabella agreed. The capitulations of Santa Fe granted Columbus the titles he sought: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Governor of all lands he discovered, and promised him a share of the wealth. In return, he promised to bring back gold, spices, and new converts. With royal backing secured, he began to prepare for the greatest voyage of his life. The ships were modest, The Nina and the Pinta were caravels, small and nimble, each about 60 feet long, with crews of around 20 to 30 men. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, was larger, a carrack about 80 feet long, but slower and harder to maneuver. Together, they carried perhaps 90 men, sailors, adventurers, and criminals spared from punishment in exchange for service. Many of them doubted their leader. Some feared they would sail off the edge of the world, though most educated men knew the earth was round. Still, the ocean was vast, and the unknown terrified them. Supplies were loaded: salted meat, dried beans, hard biscuits, barrels of water, wine, and tools. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus and his fleet set sail from Palos de la Frontera, Spain, heading first to the Canary Islands to make repairs and stock provisions before turning westward into the Great Atlantic. The voyage was grueling. The winds carried them west, but the days stretched on endlessly. For weeks, they saw nothing but water and sky. The men grew restless. They muttered about mutiny, terrified that they had been led to their deaths by a madman's dream. Columbus tried to keep their spirits alive, recording optimistic notes in his log, promising that land must be near. He even kept 2 sets of records, one truthful, one falsified, to convince the men they had traveled less distance than they actually had. The ocean tested them with storms and doldrums, with eerie stretches of seaweed in the Sargasso Sea that seemed to trap their ships. At night, they gazed at stars they had never seen before, constellations unfamiliar to European eyes. The tension was unbearable, and then, in early October, the signs began. Driftwood floated past. Birds flew overhead. The men's hopes rose. On the night of October 11th, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, cried out, "Tierra, land!" The shout carried across the dark waves. At dawn, they saw it clearly, a low, green island on the horizon. The ships anchored, and Columbus, dressed in fine clothes and carrying the royal banner of Spain, stepped ashore. He fell to his knees, kissed the ground, and gave thanks to God. The island, he thought, was part of Asia, perhaps near Japan. In truth, it was one of the Bahamian islands, which he named San Salvador. For the people who already lived there, the Taino, this was not a discovery, but the arrival of strangers who would change their lives forever. The Taino were a peaceful people, skilled farmers and fishers, living in villages of thatched huts, growing cassava, maize, and tobacco. They wore little clothing, adorned themselves with feathers and shells, and greeted the Spaniards with curiosity and generosity. Columbus saw them through the lens of conquest. He marveled at their bodies, noting they were well-built and handsome, but he also observed their simplicity, their lack of iron or steel, and their vulnerability. They would make good servants, he wrote in his journal. To him, they were souls to be converted to Christianity and laborers to be exploited. He traded trinkets and glass beads for parrots, cotton, and food. The Taino, unaware of the fate that awaited them, welcomed these newcomers with open hands. Columbus explored further, sailing to Cuba and Hispaniola. He believed he had reached islands off the coast of Asia, perhaps Cipangu or the Indies. Everywhere he went, he claimed the land for Spain, planting crosses and banners. The encounters with the Taino and other peoples were marked by misunderstanding. Where they saw neighbors and kinship, Columbus saw resources to be extracted. Gold ornaments worn by the islanders drove him to obsession. He believed that rivers of gold must lie inland, waiting to be found. The promise of wealth would justify his voyage and secure his legacy. He left behind men to build a settlement on Hispaniola, the first European foothold in the Americas, and prepared to return to Spain with news of his success. In March 1493, after storms and near disaster, Columbus sailed back into Spanish waters. He was received as a hero. The streets of Barcelona filled with crowds eager to glimpse the man who had crossed the ocean and return alive. Before Ferdinand and Isabella, he presented parrots, gold trinkets, and several captured Taino, proof of his achievement. He told tales of fertile lands, endless riches, and peoples eager to embrace Christianity. The monarchs were thrilled. They granted him another voyage, larger this time, with more ships and men. The age of discovery had begun, and Spain would be at its forefront. But behind the triumph lay a darker story. Columbus's voyages marked the beginning of European colonization in the Americas, a process that would bring disease, enslavement, and conquest to indigenous peoples. Within decades, entire populations would be decimated by smallpox, measles, and violence. The Taino, who had greeted Columbus with generosity, would see their world destroyed. The discovery was not the finding of an empty land, but the collision of two worlds, one of which carried steel, gunpowder, and imperial ambition. Columbus himself would return 3 more times to the Caribbean, never realizing he had found a new continent. He remained convinced he had reached the edges of Asia. Yet his voyages opened the door for others. Conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, settlers, missionaries, and explorers who would follow in his wake. The maps of Europe changed forever. The Atlantic became a bridge rather than a barrier, connecting 2 hemispheres in a vast exchange of peoples, goods, ideas, and tragedies. For America, the consequences were profound. The arrival of Columbus set into motion centuries of migration, conquest, and cultural transformation. The New World would become a stage upon which empires battled, peoples resisted, and new nations were born. The story of America begins here, not because Columbus was the first to set foot on its shores. He was not. Indigenous peoples had lived there for thousands of years, and even Norse explorers like Leif Erikson had reached its coast centuries earlier, but because his voyage marked the start of sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. That contact reshaped the world. As we reflect on 1492, we see both the daring and the devastation. Columbus's vision, flawed though it was, pushed him across an ocean that few dared to cross. His voyage was a leap into the unknown, driven by ambition and faith. But it also unleashed forces that would bring suffering to millions. The discovery of the New World was both a triumph of human courage and the beginning of an age of conquest. From that moment onward, the history of Europe and the history of America were forever intertwined. This was episode 1 of our American History series. In the next episode, we'll cover Jamestown and the birth of English America. Subscribe for more history stories.